So we continue our examination of different ways, or different topics in the history of Christianity, and looking at how those ideas have changed and molded over time. Today, or in this video, I should say, we are focusing on the issue of church and state in Christian history, and how the church should relate to the state is, of course, a very important question in our contemporary period, as we think about, especially in a representative republic like the United States, which enshrines the separation of church and state in its interpretation of particularly in its interpretation of the First Amendment. Of course, there's a lot of debate today about the relationship and what role religion should have in the public sphere. But as we think about it, we've gotten to a point today based on a wide variety of developments that have taken place over the 2,000 years of Christian history in the West. And so I want to basically look at just a brief overview, like we've been doing, a periodic examination of some highlights, while not covering, of course, everything that could potentially be covered on this topic. As we've done before, we're going to start in the Apostolic Period and talk about some of the things that we can see from that period. When it comes to what we can garner about Christian views of the state and the relationship between church and state in the Apostolic Period, there aren't too many passages that we can rely on, that we can examine in any great detail to really think through this larger question. Now, certainly, if we would turn to the Old Testament, we would see quite a bit about religion and government. Right? That essentially the model of government that was established in the Old Testament was that of a theocracy. And even as it moved from theocracy into monarchy, there were still, of course, very close ties and a lot of guidelines related to God's role in that. And of course, the prophets served as essentially God's enforcers of certain aspects of theology, teaching, holding on to the law, those kind of things. But as we come into the New Testament times, the situation has changed. It's a different historical situation, a different cultural context. The people of God, whether that's the Jews or as we move into the Christian period, in that first century time period, are a people under other government, particularly the Roman Empire. So there isn't the same kind of situation where you are a self-governing group that can have its own set of laws that can be either variously ruled by a king or by the laws of God, as we see in the Old Testament. So that, of course, has a profound effect on the actual lived experience of Christians. But still, even given that this is a different type of situation than the kingdom of Israel in the Old Testament, there still isn't a lot that is in the New Testament regarding Christian relationships with government. These four passages, Romans 13, 1 Peter 2, Revelation chapter 13 and 17, are some of the major sections that deal with those kind of issues. And even there, it's 7 verses in Romans 13, it's 4 verses in 1 Peter chapter 2. There really isn't a lot that can be drawn from that. From Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2, the message is the obedience due the state, that God has ordained government to serve certain functions. and that those functions are carried out for the good of people. And of course, we're talking generally here. Certainly there can be bad governments and bad governing officials who do not work for the good of their people. But in general, government, God ordained government, so that it would work for the good of people, and those that do right, can expect to be protected, can expect to live peacefully. Again, this is more of an ideal, but that doesn't change the fact that God expects Christians to, no matter what kind of government they're under, respect the leaders of that government, fulfill certain duties that are expected, responsibilities that are expected. Romans 13, of course, talks about the need to pay taxes as a Christian, that's part of the responsibilities that a Christian has. 1 Peter chapter 2, of course, talks about the importance of human institutions. Slightly different model when we get to Revelation chapter 13 and Revelation chapter 17. In those passages, government is presented differently. Now, of course, we have to be very careful when we interpret Revelation. Revelation is a very symbolic book, and I think that it's important as well to recognize that Revelation largely was talking to a first-century audience about the situations that they were facing. To ignore that it was originally written to a first-century audience and try and say, well, that's for some future time period up there, makes this document even more problematic because, well, what message does it have for those Christians that originally received it, the addressees of this book? So Revelation 13 and 17 directly relate to the governmental situations that the early Christians, particularly in the Roman province of Asia, which is today modern Turkey, the situations that they were facing. And in those passages, what we see is that government, sometimes specific individuals in government or specific governments, sometimes are the servants of Satan. That they are destructive, sometimes even self-destructive, that they are, that they can be persecutors of God's people, that there is a danger in certain governmental officials, certain leaders, and so the Christian has to be careful and compromise of principles, a compromise of beliefs, based on certain things that the government is doing. So, we don't necessarily have a contradiction here, but what we do have is kind of a difference between the universal, the ideal, and the particular. But essentially, even spending time examining each of these passages doesn't tell us a whole lot about Christian views of the state in the Apostolic Period. Now, why isn't that a major issue? Well, it's not a main topic because a lot of the other focus is sharing the message of Jesus, getting that spread, which is, of course, relatively new. This is a new work that is being done. And so, that means that there's a different focus on certain things. And the greater focus of the apostles and other Christian evangelists is on different types of things. Now, there is quite a bit said in the New Testament about the differences between the church and the world. That essentially we live in a context, no matter what our culture, where outside of the church there are forces, there are influences that could potentially lead us away from God, lead us away from the message of Jesus. And so we have to be very careful in how we relate to the world. That a lot of what the world, a particular mindset in the world, focuses on is simply those things that relate to riches, that relate to pleasure, that relate to pride. But the Christian and the church is called to something different. They are called to a higher form of life. They are called to compassion, to love, to neighborliness, to other types of things. So what then is the role of government in all of that? Well, when we think about it, there is a very important question to ask if we're thinking theologically. Is government a necessary evil, or is government something God always intended? Right? We could see how government would be something that God would have to institute because of human beings' sinfulness. Right? So human beings fall into sin, so sin exists in the world, and government is there to try and restrain sinful behavior, right? Ideally. Right? So trying to prevent murder, trying to prevent theft, other types of things. On the other hand, I think that there are some theologians that could argue that government is something that was always God's intent. Right? Adam and Eve are given dominion over the garden and the animals in the garden. So there is that notion of rule, even though it's more like caretaking. There is a sense in which they are governing God's creation. So maybe what we could say, based on thinking through some things related to the Old Testament and the New Testament, is that there was a sense in which human beings were meant to govern or take care of the earth, that there was to be some types of authoritative roles, but especially after sin entered the world, government takes on a different function, or governing becomes different in that it is meant to restrain sin. It is sometimes to enforce certain aspects of behavior in order to try and work against the effects of sin. Now that doesn't mean, of course, that governments have always done that. Sometimes governments have been promoters of sinfulness, have encouraged behaviors or engaged in behaviors that are sinful. But again, we're talking about ideals. What were the ideals that God was essentially trying to play out? Again, while not much is said in the New Testament about the relationship between the church and the state, there is quite a bit as well about how Christians should live in society. Right? Not a specific clear-cut, this is how church and state relate, but there is encouragement to live a modest life. Right? And that's not just talking about not wearing sexually provocative clothing or engaging in certain illicit types of behaviors or actions. Right? It's also about not trying to flaunt wealth. It's not trying to present yourself as something you're not. There's the simplicity there in living modestly. Another aspect, of course, about living in society is a quietness of spirit. Right? That there is this encouragement to live a life that is not about provocation. It's not about, not about anger. It's not about violence, but it is about living a quiet type of life. There's a lot about the importance of living morally and what moral behavior should look like. And in a sense, we can say, there is this encouragement to live a radical type of lifestyle. In the radicalness there is not revolutionary in a sense of going out and overthrowing governments and enforcing morality and all these other kind of things. But it is meant to, the radicalness comes in the complete disjunction between what the world is like and what Christians are like. So there is that way in which we are given some guidelines, given some ideas, some principles in the apostolic period about what does it mean to live a Christian life in society. Even though we don't have, this is how church and state should relate, this is the influence state should have over the church, this is the influence the church should have over the state.